Justice Clarence Thomas is back at the Supreme Court after mysteriously disappearing on Monday. Now he's back and is already enraging everyone by sitting in a case involving the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol that he should, by all rights, recuse himself from. Why is that? His wife, Virginia Thomas, was with Donald Trump and other VIPs in a tent near the stage from which Trump addressed the crowd on that day and encouraged them to march to the Capitol, which led to the Capitol riot. She was also in touch with the White House and other officials advocating for efforts to overturn the results of the election. In fact, the January 6th committee had obtained emails between Thomas and John Eastman, a legal advisor to the former president. Eastman had the legal theory behind Pence not certifying the election as a vice president, which they believed would cause chaos and kick it back to the states so that they could be able to put up so-called alternative or fake electors for Donald Trump, allowing him to take the election. For her part, she also had been involved with pressuring lawmakers in 2 states, for example, in Arizona. She emailed them asking them to stand strong in the face of political and media pressure and to take action to ensure that a clean slate of electors is chosen. So, yeah, definitely part of that effort to try to get these fake electors. So now that's Ginny Thomas. What does her political efforts have to do with her husband, though? Well, one of the other ways that allies of Trump had wanted to steal the election was through the Supreme Court. In fact, on December 8th, 2020, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton had sued the states of Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in order to try to invalidate the results of the presidential election there. That lawsuit was filed in the Supreme Court. Now, of course, the court had denied to hear the case, but with 2 exceptions: Justice Daniel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas. Thomas is like, oh no, let's totally hear the case. I'm very interested in invalidating the 2020 election. Gee, I wonder why. Look, the case here, though, that Thomas has failed to recuse himself involving January 6th, has to do whether or not federal prosecutors went too far in bringing obstruction charges against hundreds of participants in that Capitol riot. So former President Donald Trump actually faces the same charge for his efforts. So if the Supreme Court says prosecutors went too far for the rioters, well, then they could also make that same case for Donald Trump, saying, well, we shouldn't charge him with obstruction either. So overbroad. That's what MAGA is saying. That's what Trump's lawyers are saying. This is too broad. And one of the arguments here from the defendant, which is not Donald Trump, but one of the MAGA rioters, is that, hey, look, this is too broad, and this could have an effect on peaceful protesters. Now, obviously, that's something that I care a lot about, right? But what the other side is saying, the prosecution is saying, is this law is a catch-all that's designed to deal with the obstruction of official proceedings. In fact, the administration's top SCOTUS lawyer said that the defendant joined a violent mob that stormed the U.S. Capitol to prevent the peaceful transition of power. And that this law is being read too narrowly by the defense. So here's the thing. Why is someone who is married to someone else who was there on that day, all right, a person who was there on that day and tried to overturn the election and will be potentially embarrassed if these charges are held up, why is that person allowed to make a decision if the charges will be held up? It feels like there's a bit of a conflict here, okay? A little bit of a personal stake. Look, Ginny Thomas is a true believer. And you could argue she's technically a victim of Donald Trump's crimes, even though she wouldn't consider herself to be much of a victim. What crimes? Well, Donald Trump's alleged was spreading the big lie that caused a riot in the first place, okay? And so she has a reputational stake in everything involved in January 6th, as does he. So that right there is enough to make it, kind of unethical for him to be presiding over any case involved with January 6th, whether it be the rioters, whether it be Trump's case, etc. So I think that he's going to protect his wife, and I think that's one reason, as well as his own reputation, of course, and why he should recuse. And by the way, recusing himself would do much more to protect his reputation than staying on the case and showing his very obvious, in my view, bias. Okay. Now, actor John Cryer posted this on X about Thomas, that Justice Thomas, whose spouses at the very least supported and helped organize elements that were used in Trump's coup attempt, has not recused from this case as a sign of his utter corruption. Well, I mean, I would say that, and as well as being showered by gifts from billionaires and then potentially presiding over future cases that help said billionaire, but that's also corruption. Now, Cryer was retweeting a post from self-described lapse lawyer Mike Sachs, who reported that Justice Thomas has just suggested J6 legally is no different than any other violent attempt to disrupt official proceedings. Economist reporter Stephen Mazzy agreed that it was kind of wild to see Thomas participate in the January 6th oral arguments, particularly when his wife was one of the protesters that day and had worked assiduously to get the 2020 election overturned. I already went through some of the details on that. Others observed questions coming from Thomas on Tuesday were kind of insulting. Just a side note, Justice Thomas is a condescending prick. He's laugh-talking at Prelogar like she's an idiot when he is the one asking bad questions. Prelogar is, of course, Elizabeth Prelogar. She's the acting Solicitor General to the United States. That is the administration's top SCOTUS lawyer. Now, she continues by pointing out that the conservative justice keep asking the same lame hypotheticals. Thomas is saying, for example, do you think that obstruction is worth 20 years in prison? Now, that is the maximum sentence for someone who has been convicted of obstruction. For the record, not one of the J6 rioters has received the maximum sentence for obstruction. Now, the longest J6-related sentence actually is Enrique Tarrio. That is the former chair of the Proud Boys, who was sentenced to 22 years in prison, not for obstruction, but for seditious conspiracy. Tarrio wasn't even at the Capitol on January 6th. None of the people who were, hit with obstruction got even anywhere close to 20 years. In fact, Prelogar noted that the average term imposed so far for obstruction is actually about 2 years. And there's a mixture of different things. There's prison time, there's fines, there's, probation in some of these cases. And so, look, asking that question, pretty ridiculous. So you can see, though, where Thomas's bias lies and why he should not be overseeing this or any other J6-related case. Just because there's a maximum sentence for something doesn't mean it's always used. It's rarely used. In fact, most lower court judges who have weighed in on this issue, they've allowed the obstruction charge to stand. That includes Trump appointees. Now, one last response here. This is legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, who said that Thomas was, quote, minimizing the severity of the 1/6 insurrection at the Capitol, and perhaps that's because his wife was part of the conspiracy. What a disgrace that he is sitting on this case. Look, yeah, I agree. I know he's not required to recuse himself, but he really should. I think he's way too close to this case. That's it. Now, I'm sure someone on the right will try to make the comparison here between Juan Merchan, his daughter, who raised money for Democrats. See, he should recuse himself. If Clarence Thomas has to recuse himself, then what about Juan Merchan? Is it the same thing, though? No, not really. She makes money as somebody who helps fundraise for political campaigns. Okay, she would make money regardless of whether Trump runs or not, because again, you still would have to have someone to fundraise for these political campaigns. They can fundraise off Trump, sure. They can fundraise off their opponents as well. That doesn't prove any sort of bias Also, she wasn't involved in any efforts to overturn the result of a legitimate election. There's just no there, all right? Definitely not the same thing. And so if you're going to use that argument, it's going to be whataboutism. So that said, Justice Thomas shouldn't be allowed to hear this case. But unfortunately, that's not the way our legal system works. These judges, they don't have any real ethical standards to abide by. And if they don't feel like recusing themselves, like Thomas, then they're not going to. And there's not a whole lot that you and I can do about it.